Hello. Um, I've been doing a bunch of these talks lately, so hopefully you're not sick of me yet. It's the day before Thanksgiving, and I'm thinking people might have traveling to do. So if you're interested, you'll have a lot of material to listen to in the car. I am putting these on Anchor or whatever, Spotify, Google podcasty things, so you can find the link to that on Wrench in the Gears. There's a page for audio, if that works. Some of these things are better visually. And I'm really supposed to be doing some work finishing up my slide deck for Saturday for Drew and Tucson. But as I was going through my email, which I've winnowed down quite a bit, I get a lot less junk email these days, but there was an email from Social Finance. And if you guys know, that's sort of like the linchpin of my research into impact investing. And then that door of impact investing leads to digital twinning and social simulation modeling, and potentially towards a future where our consciousness is supposed to be put into some sort of transferable format, I think is the idea. And so I wanted to take a few minutes and revisit an early blog post that I wrote. These early Pay for Success finance programs were in California. I have a friend who was sort of introduced me to these deals that were going on at the time in like 2015, and it just keeps running forward. And this email that I saw today, I realized, oh, wow, this totally intersects with the Nicholas Berggruen and the Berggruen Institute's efforts. And as I've spent more time thinking about this complex adaptive systems and the idea of holons and order from chaos and the adjacent possible and the idea of agents and engineered simulations. The Berggruen Institute's efforts into there are four areas, which are essentially remaking capitalism, remaking democracy. Let me go back and look here just a sec. Remaking capitalism, remaking democracy, and remaking what it is to be human. So here's Berggruen Institute, the future, redoing the future of capitalism here. And I think down here we've got the remaking democracy, the future of democracy working group. And then, let's see, over here we have transformations of the human, which was a spinoff, but was one of the program. And I'm trying to think of what the fourth one is. They have a consultancy around all of that. And then maybe it was just three. Maybe they were, maybe they had a much more manageable plan to remake capitalism, remake democracy, and remake humanity. But I'm starting to realize, after spending so much time on the Descent program, the way in which the tokenization of voting, so to speak, and social exchange sort of relates to the social physics of that, to the biophysics of bodily operations, both internal to our body, and then social operations, which are outside of our body, and the intention to engineer at all of these myriad levels through bringing these natural rules of natural science into the social sector. And so really this idea of remaking capitalism, which is money, and remaking democracy, which is voting, they're both sort of signals. They're signals in this larger communication system. So as I'm looking at this email from Social Science, and I'm thinking, oh, wow. So now you're building off of this blueprint to renew California, which is something was one of the core aspects of that I was looking at initially around the California Digital Identity Program. And this was framed, this legislation was advanced earlier by Robert Hertzberg. who's in the California Senate and the majority leader. And it was framed not specifically around health passports as much as sort of the governance. So he had this Senate Bill 1190 that he was advancing in that area. And it also actually specifically included education transcripts, because I think what the attempt is currently being made now is to network our consciousness, right? To create formalized networks of shared consciousness for problem solving and modeling consciousness, modeling intellect, modeling emotion in the simulations. And so initially I found out about Robert Hertzberg, who is a very, very long time California Politico influencer, very connected. For a while worked for a Chicago-based global law firm, Mayer Brown, which is now involved in social impact bond portfolios. Surprise, surprise. Hertzberg was heavily involved in both the California Pharmacy Board and remaking education in California and remaking government. And so he had actually worked with Nicholas Berggruen. My Synthetic Pretender series was sort of centered on Berggruen, on this Remaking California program. Yeah, here's Berggruen. The blueprint to renew California. And it wasn't actually, it's from 2012. It was not a huge group of people, all told. It was about 14 people, but bipartisan, many based in California, but not all. There was David Bonderman from Fort Worth, Texas. But it included luminaries like Eric Schmidt of Google Alphabet, Schmidt Futures, also with ties to Bell Labs. It had conservatives like Condoleezza Rice, connected with the Stanford and the Hoover Institute and former State Department security advisor. So the conservative side, also Eli Broad, who was very familiar with in the education space around the privatization of education, but is also a philanthropist in the art space. And he made his money in housing. And so I think there's going to be a lot coming up with affordable housing management. Gray Davis, the former California governor, was on this Blueprint to Renew California group. Laura Tyson, an economist at Berkeley, with a focus on social impact. On the liberal side, Antonia Hernandez, who was an aide to Ted Kennedy and worked in the immigration space and with the California Community Foundation. So it's these large foundations that are advancing. And let's see, Gavin Newsom was part of the Jobs Task Force, and the focus was, again, on workforce-aligned education. And that's going to be the Learn card, right? And your Learn card is going to be sort of your repository for being an agent in the game. Gavin Newsom's mentor, Willie Brown, was a member of this group. And, at the time when I was adding these various dots to the map, I was really shocked. Willie Brown, being an assembly member and former mayor of San Francisco, that he actually had ties to Jim Jones, and that Jim Jones for a while was connected to the public housing in San Francisco, which, again, as we're talking about what's coming with affordable housing and managing people in games and indoctrination into potential cultish behavior, to me, Jim Jones, his story, his legacy as it applies to the future of housing first services towards posthumanism is really interesting. So anyway, so I'm going to get along. This gives you some sense, again, of the fact, as you're reading this, I think you'll see this idea of renewing California. So this is 10 years ago, this Blueprint to Renew. Now we're 10 years on. They have all of these pilots for social impact finance coming. They're moving on to starting to scale these, to bring these to scale. It's a lot of it is about the story. And again, so much of California's history is about the story we tell ourselves about, like, the American dream, right? But then the reality of it. And the way in which both Hollywood and military behavioral psychology play into telling us certain stories to move us down certain paths. But it's very clear that what Berggruen's ideas are about remaking capitalism, democracy, and being a human. Like the transforming what it is to be human is the ultimate goal, as I understand it now. And it has everything to do not with communism or socialism or even stakeholder capitalism as much as it does with sociobiology. So I want to take a quick second and just run. There's a clip here that I want to share, and I'm trying to remember where it was. It's about Future of Democracy Working Group. Oh, yes. So this was a clip from Bob Hirschberg. This was about decentralized democracy. And I understand this now as I understand the tokenization of the commons and what Protocol Labs is doing. I understand this better. It was a pitch around restoring California's promise. And this came out of the Milken Institute. And that's Michael Milken, who was the junk bond trader that brought down, Drexel Burnham Lambert. And so Hertzberg was an affiliate with the Milken Institute, and he's talking about decentralized democracy. And I'm thinking at the time, wow, okay, these are tokens. This is trading tokens in the commons. It's the new kind of democracy. And there's a paper that's cited in there, and I didn't know it at the time because, again, you don't have the context. Until you have the context, you can't situate something. But this paper was actually about from Decent. The social currency paper. And it's fascinating because, again, that whole other huge map that I did is now that Decent panel. But freedom, tool chain design, and application to pilot projects. This was at the 3rd International Conference on Social and Complementary Currencies, which was held in October of 2015 in Salvador, Brazil. So this goes exactly back to what I was talking about with the Banco Palmas and the social currencies in Brazil, how that all goes together. And they actually have a whole section here on social proof of work. So, we've moved from proof of work to proof of stake. And this idea of social currencies as signals and messaging our relationality and values to the machine, this idea of a social proof of work is really important. Here it's talking about social proof of work. And again, this is going to build into the social reputation aspect, but I think they're going to try to sell it as not something punitive like a social credit score, but more like something that brings you privileges, and as opposed to being punitive. And I'm not sure why this is not coming up, but social proof of work was this whole section. And I think, yes, social POW. And I think that this is something that we should spend more time on. Again, if you're spending half your intellectual free time thinking about Web3 and thinking about social currencies, I would love to have other people thinking through what this social proof of work means. So now I'm just going to go back to the clip with Hertzberg because I think it's pretty short, but it actually talks about the New World Order, which is interesting. This is from 2010, and he has a very bizarre watch on. Like, you can see this big clunky watch and it's bright red. So I don't know if this is like an early wearable or something, but we'll just listen to him.
Well, I'm an optimist in the sense that we talk about fixing California. Look, it's been a great place. There's been a lot of phenomenal stuff happening here. The question is, in the New World Order, how do we make it work? How do we make the democracy work? How do we make the economy vibrant so we have opportunity for folks? And I think it's about radical decentralization, which means that right now in the real world, about 75% of what the state budget is administered at the local level. And so people don't want to send their money to Sacramento. They see it as waste, fraud, and abuse. But if they can touch it and feel it and see it locally, if you decentralize, what you end up getting is a place where you can move quicker, and Fresno can compete with San Diego and can compete with San Francisco. And you don't get this centralization, so the economy can really work and hum in the various regions that make up California. And the second thing that you get that we don't generally think about a lot is a democracy that works. Some young Latina gets elected in Montebello to the school board, or some Asian American woman to the city council in Monterey Park. And they get elected and they're excited at their election and they think they've got real power. And they find out that everything is controlled out of Sacramento. And so the reality is that they're not really real. Democracy's not really working. And so there's a disconnect. There's a frustration with ordinary folks. They feel powerless. You got to really reinvent the system. Do you need to fix the budget? Yeah. That's a little bit of noise. That's redecorating the staterooms in the Titanic. Can you fix term limits? Yeah, okay, people are nicer to each other. So now they're a little bit more orderly as the Titanic is sinking. Can you do open primary? All those things are important to begin to build confidence. Redistricting, okay. But it doesn't get to the fundamental architecture of power, which is changing now in this globalizing economy. Money is at the core of it. You've got to incentivize capital. If you don't do that, I don't care, you're gonna be Detroit, and you're gonna take what was the inner city and turn them into farmlands, and that's about as good as it's gonna get. And so these are great challenges, but challenges that we can meet. But it requires a bigger vision. It requires a bigger narrative about what we're about what we are in California, what we are in Southern California. And I think that this whole notion of radical decentralization, creating a democracy that's vibrant, that works for communities, at the same time creates an ability in this new globalizing economy to compete and move quickly, is at the cornerstone of our success.
All right. And so you can see behind him the Milken Institute. And I'm just going to take a second here to pull up so in this section of this map, this is the descent map about neuroeconomics, and we've been going through this one. We just talked about it last night. Paul Glimcher and the Philicides Center out of the New York Psychoanalytic Institute, and that they had this panel in 2007, so that's about 3 years in advance of where we hear Hertzberg talking about remaking democracy in California. It's important to know that like within this framing of essentially the evolutionary framing that is being asserted is this idea of more, that everything has to, that the evolution imperative is to do more. It's always more to win the game so that your gene pool moves on to the next level. And that's how the game has been built. And it's very much around this sort of premise of like econometrics, right? Economics, hedge fund, betting, and it's quite a brutal game. And so, like within the map, I sort of laid out at the time that Paul Glimcher was in graduate school and really developing his formative ideas around economics and neuroeconomics and how to get people to make quote unquote good decisions. This was the go-go 90s, late 80s and early 90s, the Wolf of Wall Street era. In which Michael Milken and the junk bond traders were sort of ruled the roost in all of this. And Drexel Burnham Lambert, that Drexel was originally Anthony Drexel in Philadelphia, although that trading firm was in New York. And Milken himself, I talked about this a little bit in my Philadelphia site visit talk about Anthony Drexel and trading paper and his legacy at Drexel Burnham Lambert. Michael Milken's company, and it was all stories that they spun. Again, it's not unlike what's happening now in the crypto space, right? You sell stories, you get people invested, and then you do controlled demolitions, and then you set up the next story arc. And so what Michael Milken was doing was developing this junk debt and saddling companies with it. And one of the companies he was involved with early on was KinderCare. So as we look at the plan to manage children as data commodities and to manage them for to normalize life in ubiquitous computing and extended reality, and that would start in pre-K. That's where the universal pre-K imperative is coming from, is that they want to bring the children in and raise them in a certain way so that they will be more accepting of the future that is planned out. Milken had this long relationship to KinderCare, and then after he helped bankrupt them, he later bought them out again after he got out of jail. So in one of the early talks that I had seen about blockchain, besides the New America one with Sean Conaway, was actually this gathering from 2016 called Blockchain, A Revolution You Need to Understand. And this was at the Milken Institute. It had a panel of, I think, 4 or 5 people, including the guy who at the time was running the digital media for MIT, Digital Currency Initiative, And I'm going to just run this 2-minute clip. This is actually from the Q&A at the end. So it had the gentleman from MIT working on learning records. At that point, it was called the Learning Machine. It's since taken on, like spun out and taken on sort of a different name. But this idea of the Learn card really stems from a comprehensive learner record, and using your learning, which is using your access to your intellect as currency, right? Currency, and feeding that into the machine learning. And then there was another woman in the room who was working on tracking diamonds on blockchain in South Africa. And I can't remember who the third member, but in the Q&A, it's almost like a planted question. So that, again, this is at the Milken Institute, which is in the greater Los Angeles area. And that's sort of just south of where Hertzberg's district is. He's not far from the Milken Institute, but they bring in people from all over the world. And in the audience, there's I believe it's a planted question because it's from someone from Milken High School, private high school, but talking about measuring grades and how do we know the quality of a grade is consistent across school to school. And so this is the answer from the guy from MIT Media Lab. And again, he's only telling part of the story here.
In community high school, and I was looking at in terms of, okay, there's diamonds and there's money, but what about grading? Like if you, I think as a teacher, could give some student, one teacher in one school could get a C in chemistry and another could get an A, but the one who got the C might know more chemistry than A, so than the other. So how could you maybe use blockchain to validate what somebody knows and be able to trust that they know something?
Brian, go ahead.
Well, one thing that we're working on, another thing that people have suggested is, so I think what you're describing is not really a blockchain per se problem. But I do think that one thing that we experienced and one thing that we're working on are certificates for diplomas. So can you validate that person actually studied and graduated from that school? And then when you take that a layer down, can you authenticate what the grades or the transcript of that person, right? And we were talking to a school district who was quite interested in this because they get students who are coming in and out of their school district, and so they wanted an open, interoperable way to be able to transfer grades from different schools and different classes, which would have been really effective. But I know when I went to graduate school, they said you're accepted upon condition of receiving your notarized transcripts, right, from that school. And so UCLA sent my transcripts, right, and they put a rubber stamp on the back of it, right, so that if you open it, you can see that it was torn. But what should happen is you just have a validated, kind of notarized in a way, transcript that is sent electronically, not through the mail. We are in the 21st century.
I'll just answer the
community.
Yeah. So, and you can hear how he's answering that. So he's offering a really, really limited use case. He's not talking about the digital twins. He's not talking about global telepresence labor. He's not talking about blockchain mind files. The intention is to keep things really, really limited. This is just an image from the Milken Institute. One of the members of the advisors on financial markets for the Milken Institute is someone named Daniel Gorfine. And Gorfine himself was involved in the Digital Dollar Foundation, but not just digital money, because I think, again, the central bank digital currency discussion is in and of itself really limited, and it needs to be essentially a subset of the idea of a social currency conversation, an ecology of social currencies. Gorfine, beyond being involved with Digital Dollar, was part of Gattaca Horizons, literally they're using Gattaca in the name, which is about fintech regulation consulting. Flourish Ventures, which is a social impact fintech program, and Lab CFTC, which is commodities futures trading. So again, he was part of a former advisor between 2011 and 2017 to the Milken Institute, and the former chief innovation officer shortly thereafter of the Commodities Futures Trading Commission. And so essentially what what Brian Ford was not saying in that clip was that they need to create the digital transcript so that they can expand out in public the human capital betting program. And California is the largest economy in the United States. It has many children who are low income, who are immigrants, who would, on the superficial level, be really interesting as movable data commodities, movable as data on a dashboard. And so the focus on California on the liberal side, and then Texas on the conservative side, those two economies have the most children. And I want to just, this is an image that a map, this is way back from, on the Wayback Machine, but from, it was one of the Little Sis maps that got deleted. But this shows the Digital Dollar Foundation, and J. Christopher Giancarlo, who is a co-founder of that, along with Daniel Gorfine and Charles Giancarlo, who's Jay Christopher's brother. They were testifying early on in the lockdowns at this inclusive banking congressional hearing. Inclusive banking during a pandemic, using Fed accounts and digital tools to improve stimulus payments. And so, dial us back a couple years, and we can see where these things are all coming from, how the money is connected not just to public health outcomes, but also to education outcomes and mental health. Because just as the biochemistry monitoring helps give them information about biological constructs or the embodiment of what it is to be human, it is I think the education and the mental health data that is even more intriguing to them, because what they're ultimately after is consciousness, is a way into consciousness. And they will do that through collections of tokens, reducing us to digital agents in a game, exchanging tokens, and then reading those exchanges as signals into to guide evolution to this next level. So, just to walk through again, we're talking about education transcripts. I've always been saying since the very beginning, it's not just a health event. This is a data event. It's an evolutionary event of which there's a lot of fluidity between the money side of things and the education side. And at this point, I've just gone back to education largely because, as far as I'm concerned, most of the health freedom space is just woefully lost. They're just cut in the same groove, and they can't get out of looking at anything but healthcare white papers and testimony. So we've got the banking. J. Christopher Giancarlo was an associate with Curtis Mallet Prevost, who was a legal representative for Drexel Burnham Lambert, which was Milken's program. We have Gorfine over here. He's the guy who's connected to the commodities futures trading. The Giancarlo brothers, one of them is linked into this thing, which I find really interesting, the Phoenix software, which is prediction modeling. And they were doing work with Argonne National Lab, University of Chicago, Chalmers University in Sweden, I believe, and calculus. So prediction markets, using equations to make predictions on outcomes. And then he was also involved, here's just the commodities futures trading section, the futures markets themselves. And then going back and understanding where the automated trading came from, where these early cap and trade carbon emissions trading things came from. A lot of them came from the Bay Area, and all of that being sort of creative finance and securitized. And then a partner in the Digital Dollar Foundation is Accenture, and Accenture is very deeply into the impact finance space, both in terms of creating social impact deals, working on health and human service data management. This guy, Gary Glickman, was a key figure in results-based finance and the idea of smart cards. And the smart cards in and of themselves, those are going to be our smart card linked to some individual communication technology is our representation as our twin. So I don't know if that's I'm just going to pull up the Learn card. image again so that we remember what the node looks like, right? This is this is our digital twin as a Voronoi polyhedra with planes of influence that can be pushed and pulled, whether health situations or money situations or education situations. So this is moving forward, and this is part of the Florida map that I'm doing because Broward, Colorado and Broward County are the two pilots. So when we look and see over here back on the California map, like we shouldn't be shocked that Robert Hertzberg, when he's rolling out the legislation for the California Senate bill for the trust framework digital identity, that in that was embedded an intention to integrate that into education transcripts because it dials all the way back in. So, you know, and before we move on to me reading about the social finance, this is about an 8-minute video and it's longer, but I feel like it's really useful to try to practice getting your mind around that the commons, the commoning, the democracy, the tokens are about sociobiology. It is about transforming human relationships and relationships between humans and the environment into something that looks more like a superorganism of a beehive or an ant colony or a termite mound. So it's not really political in the way we're trained to think of it as, oh, you're talking about socialism or communism. No, we're talking about social insects. And through that social insect rule modeling, that is what's guiding us towards this transition that they want us to be like social insects. And so early on when I was doing the education stuff, one of the people I was in touch with, he was actually a film editor in New York and was pretty familiar with a lot of the technologies at the time. And like we since have parted ways, but I remember him being really sort of I think when people who work in the tech space start to put the pieces together, like not unlike Joseph Gonzalez, you know, who was someone that I knew like at the beginning of the lockdowns, when you see how the AI fits with the blockchain, fits with the simulations, fits with the disembodiment, fits in with the finance, it's very weighty, this realization of how everything is converging to a certain point. And this guy, Michael, was someone that I had encountered early on, I think, who I didn't appreciate it at the time, but I think he must have started to grasp where it was all going, because he said, Allison, like in New York, you can't actually get access to any of these film editing studios anymore because they're all tied up for working on like synthetic people. They're all working on making synthetic people right now. You can't even get time for editing in New York City anymore. And like, why, like, and this was, you know, and this is someone who's in the education space, and for the most part, they're all lost too. You know, they can't wrap their mind around what it means to live in a world where you're guided by, you know, a personal learning coach who happens to be a synthetic person who's your minder for the rest of your life. But they were building that, like they were building this in New York at the time. So if you understand that the ant colony simulation model is what social media is, and that we, like, to a certain extent, some of us are in it more deeply than others in terms of being nudged and moved by algorithmic swarm consciousness behavior. But their intention is to keep with the cybernetic feedback, doubling down until our whole life becomes like this encoded ant simulation game. So this is about 8 minutes, but I would just ask you as you watch this and listen and look at how he's coding the simulation, that this is actually real. It's not an abstraction, that there are mechanics of how to do this. And there are many, many people out there right now who have been trained to do this. But if you're in that world, you just don't even know that this is something to pay attention to. And, you know, and Cliff and I had a good conversation yesterday. We were talking about guided evolution with Julian Huxley and the primacy of the human versus a more indigenous cosmology where it involves sky women and reciprocity among relatives on the earth. And we didn't have time to run this ant simulation. So I want to run it today as a setup to talk about social impact next. So.
Ants. Essentially, how it goes is we place a virtual ant at one of these towns, which then needs to pick a new town to travel to that it hasn't visited yet. The the ant would prefer some place nearby, so I'll calculate each town's desirability as 1 over the distance raised to some power. The higher that power is, the more strongly the ant will prefer the nearby towns. It'll make its final decision at random, but the probabilities are weighted based on that desirability value. So let's watch our adventurous little ant on its mission. Now that it has visited every town, we can retrace its steps to see the path that it took. It's not a fantastic path, but solving the entire problem is a lot to ask of one tiny ant, so let's give it some friends to help it explore. Once they've all finished their journeys, what we'll do is score each of their paths by how good they are, and these will act like pheromone trails, as the analogy goes, to help guide the next round of ants. So ultimately, each ant chooses the next town in its path probabilistically based on the distance to the town and the strength of the pheromone trail there. In that way, each new group of ants explores random variations of the best paths found so far, and any improvements are reinforced thanks to the pheromones. Let's try run this new approach on those 20 towns from earlier to see if it actually works. I've slowed the simulation down so we can get an idea of how the pheromone trails change over time, and here it's already settled into a really good-looking path. It took about 50 ants a split second to find this, which is a nice improvement from the 6 centuries we were facing before, although of course the trade-off is we have no assurance that this is actually the best possible solution. Just for fun, and please try to contain your excitement, I'm going to ramp this up to 100 towns. Here again, I am showing a slowed down view of the pheromone trails, but it's maybe interesting as well if I run it again, and instead display the best path the ants have found so far, so we can see how that develops over time as well. So I think this is a really cool algorithm. The only slightly annoying thing is there are a number of parameters for controlling the simulation, and it does take a bit of trial and error to find values that work well for a given problem. Anyway, this has got me interested in playing around with a less practical but more sort of fun visual simulation of ants. So I started by making a simple flat ant graphic and brought it to life a little with a crude walk animation. I then imported it into Unity, but something went terribly wrong in the process. And the result was mildly terrifying. I got it working in the end though, and wrote some code to make it follow this green dot around, which is going to represent the ant's food source. Here's the ant's code as it stands right now, and I want to modify this quickly to get the ant to wander about on its own. I'll try achieve this by simply nudging the desired direction by some random vector each frame, and let's see how that looks. This ant is too indecisive and not making much progress in its life, but I can turn the wander strength way down, and now it's exploring its surroundings quite nicely. I think the next step should be for the ant to be able to sense food if it's nearby and pick it up. So I've added some lines of code for handling that, and let's test this with just one ant to start with. That's working well, I think, so now I'll test this with a bunch of ants. The ants shouldn't just greedily keep all the food they find for themselves, though. They need to take it back home to support the colony. I really don't know much about ants, so I did a little research about how they even find their way home. It turns out they're smarter than I'd imagined. For example, beyond recognizing landmarks, which is pretty impressive, some desert-dwelling species are apparently able to combine directional information from polarized light with distance information from essentially an internal pedometer to calculate a straight path back home. I'd like to keep things simple though, and have all navigation done via pheromones. So, inspired by this really cool video that I came across, I'm going to have the ants use 2 types of pheromones. This blue one they'll lay down when leaving their home to search for food, and then if they actually find food, they should turn around and follow the blue pheromones home, while laying down these red pheromones to try recruit other ants to the food source. They're not doing a great job at the moment, but that's not their fault. I haven't actually implemented the pheromone following yet. So for that, I'm going to ask each ant to sample 3 regions in front of it. And based on the concentration of pheromones it detects in these regions, it will either turn left, keep moving forwards, or turn right, plus a little bit of random turning still on top of that. I think this is a nice simple way of handling it, which I actually came across in this paper, which describes an approach to that problem we looked at the start of the video, inspired by slime molds of all things. It's quite intriguing, so I might come back to it, but for now I'll just be borrowing this little sensory scheme for the ants. Here's the actual code for it, and as you can see down here, I've made the pheromones lose strength over time to sort of mimic the effect of evaporation. I'd really like the pheromones to also diffuse outwards over time, but I'm not quite sure how to handle that yet. Anyway, let's give this a quick trial run with a handful of ants. Okay, it seems to be working roughly how I intended, so next up I want the ants to be able to avoid obstacles, or at least not simply walk right through them. So I've spent a bit of time writing some dubious collision detection code, which does nevertheless seem to be getting the job done. I then wanted to generate some sort of map like one of these from this ancient tutorial series of mine. I have a strong aversion to my old code though, so instead of reusing that project like a reasonable person, I began re-implementing it all from scratch. After several hours' work, however, I came to the realization that my new code is not so great either. Fast forwarding through some frustration, I eventually did get it working, and I also added a brush that I could easily paint in obstacles or carve out little passageways. Come to think of it, I could have just taken 2 minutes to draw this in Paint, but anyway, I ended up making this map for the ants, and I wrote a simple spawner script to scatter some clumps of food about the place. And so, with all this set up, let's unleash 500 ants from their nest and see what they get up to. Over on the right, the ants have collected that entire food cluster, but they'll keep returning there for a while still, until the pheromone trail has finally evaporated. Real ants are vastly more sophisticated than what I'm simulating here, of course, and in this situation, for example, I read that phero ants have been found to actually deposit repellent pheromones when a resource has been depleted, to discourage future ants from that trail. This has been fun to play with, and there are many things I'd still like to try out, but my attention has been sidetracked somewhat by these strange and fascinating slime mold organisms.
All right. So I've decided to stop before we get to slime mold, but I mean, if you're watching, like I would love to get your opinions about this. For me, it was really helpful to sort of imagine, let me see, I'm just like looking at this idea of creating openings or barriers and what that looks like in terms of digital communication and relationships. Like, and when you see the actual code that they use, right? I mean, this is just very, he has the code systems, right? And so the digital landscapes that we're navigating, and those digital landscapes may just be like hyperlinks or social media feeds, they're actually programming it. Like, they have the capacity. I mean, I can't point my finger and say, like, I know who's programming it, but at the base, it can all be programmed with reinforcers or discouragers. Like, when they said, oh, here, what are the food sources you've got a model and you've got a food source. So you can have different kinds, but maybe the food source is engagement, right? Reciprocal engagement and validation. And so that goes to a certain point and then it runs out and then it gets redirected and then they have spawn nodes. And so that can come through the computing mechanism, right? And then, if you're like some of us, you're just like left over way over here outside of everybody else. I think if you actually get to the point that you can understand, like, look, there are bits of code. And this idea that they, like, if this is what they can accomplish, doing complex equations with models of ants, what they might be able to, what they imagine they may be able to accomplish with models of humans and human consciousness and collective human consciousness. Like steering people right or left, like looking at digital trails and pheromones. I think if we were actually, if we cared about more egalitarian systems of co-living, like we would train people to know that this is happening and that this is the terrain that we're navigating right now. And, I wouldn't have gone down this trail of trying to figure this stuff out, except the intensity of the past, almost getting on 3 years now of the lockdowns and being forced into a digital acculturation, and then having evolving relationality with people over time that has a lot of ups and downs, sometimes very abruptly, and sometimes you don't understand things. But then if you look and you imagine that this guy is saying like, oh, I can create barriers. There can be a barrier and I can open it up, right? Like if you're providing a narrative that helps enforce the system of power, either by directly or indirectly, because you can support the system of power even by opposing it in the opposite direction if what they're looking at for is polarity, right? And so if you are serving power either by advancing a certain program or by pulling it back, like you can be moved in that way. Like you can be moved in the way that we've been talking about, like the Learn card and the vibrating prism, and they can change the landscape, this fitness landscape of the game, which is what Cliff and I talked about a little bit yesterday. So now consider this within the context of social impact, right? Consider it within the context of nudging. The programming is the nudge. The programming is when here they're saying, oh, that our rule is to find the shortest distance between towns in this traveling salesman algorithm. That's efficiency and optimization. Now, they talk about it as path planning, but really it is achieving a specified goal accomplished. And that's what impact finance is. That's what outcomes-based finance is. It is to specify an end of the path, to specify a project within certain terms, within a certain amount of flexibility, and then to find the efficiency in it. And they talk about using individuals to find efficiency and then using hundreds, right? Like if one individual is efficient, imagine that we can get teams together, right? These would be maybe considered decentralized teams of ants. And then you run tens of thousands of simulations to get the most pristine level of efficiency. And I don't know about you, but this helps me understand it so much better. And this is what I'm hoping to convey to the people in Tucson, is that they're guiding us in a polarizing game board where there's lots of obstacles. And when they want to steer us, they just put an obstacle in our path and bounce us around. But we are stuck in their cybernetic game board, or they're attempting to keep us in there, and we don't have to stay there. So I think that this was what the cyber physical environment and social impact finance deals are. So with all of this in the background, with Robert Hertzberg's and the push for digital identity, where in some ways it seems like we're being milked for our data so that we can embody the robots over here, like the Cardano, Sophia the robot, so we can give our essence to the robots to become embodied even as we are being dematerialized as manipulable data. And that Hertzberg is working with Berggruen on this idea of remaking democracy with tokens, and tokenized social currencies, remaking the future of capitalism, and then ultimately remaking foundationally what it means to be a human, the transformations of the human, and that is in Berkeley. And just to make it clear, that the entity that they're talking about is California 100. And they have this advising council. This is a vision. So you have the blueprint to reimagine California in 2012. Now, 10 years later, you've got the California 100, a vision and strategy for the next century. And then I was looking at the advisors list. The areas of focus: advanced technology, arts, culture, and entertainment, because of course we need a good story to get us to do everything. Education, which is the stackable credentials. Economic mobility and the workforce, which is workforce aligned training. Energy and the environment, that's the ESG, the sustainability and the carbon trading. Fiscal reform, again, that's going to be stakeholder capitalism and accountability in the blockchain smart contract layer. That same goes for governance. You've got health and wellness. And I would just emphasize, if you haven't seen my blog, last night I posted a guest post from a friend, Julene, who is in the Salt Lake City area, about a new digital health initiative targeting a large region of the West for advanced children's health, and a lot of the people are connected to wearable technology and wireless and data. You've got housing and community development, because of course affordable housing is huge, and they're looking to really move us towards a co-housing model. Now, I mean, I will say, I'm not necessarily I live in a row house. It's not teeny tiny. It's not huge. It's not a mega suburban house. I'm not necessarily a major proponent for suburban sprawl in and of itself. I like living in an urban environment, but I know it's not for every person. The plan is to create more and more compact housing and co-housing and shared housing. But I don't think it will be because people are of themselves choosing that. It's because economically they won't have any other choice. And Jason was just telling me that there's something called Flow, that Adam Newman was being backed. He was the guy behind WeWork and We Live and the school based connected to WeWork. And that all collapsed, and they're like, we don't know what that was. And I'm like, it was about sociobiology, folks. It's about the hive mind consciousness. It's creating the outside in robot as these co-living spaces. And I think that Boots Riley book, movie, Sorry to Bother You, it had that kind of model, right? Like a hostel, some sort of collective housing. And again, on the one hand, I'm not saying that shouldn't be anybody's choice. There are a lot of people who choose to live in a small footprint, live with other people, live in intentional community. I'm not against that in theory, but it is going to be tied to data surveillance and behavior optimization. And even though I'm sure that there are a lot of people who've maybe lived in co-housing things house shares, where you wish that you could probably put people on a behavioral improvement plan to make them a better roommate. I think that there's larger concerns about what that means once we move into digital twins. And then the last bits are public safety and criminal justice reform. As in the past, I've written about this idea of prison reform to incarcerate the world, that the new goal of justice, for especially something that isn't a violent crime, will be an open air prison with e-carceration and improvement, putting people on improvement plans. So that's the changes that are happening. That's why, Soros has been buying up all the district attorneys to reformat the legal system, which I think is very loosey-goosey at the moment, but eventually will be locked in once they have the digital identity programs in place. And it will become much more rigid once they can, again, have your sensor technology and your digital ID and drone surveillance and, the Boston Dynamic robot dogs. And then you've got transportation and urban planning, which, it's about the watchers, right? We have Vision Zero, which is avoiding pedestrian deaths, which again, I don't want pedestrians to be killed, but I don't know that we necessarily need high level surveillance on every street corner that's how you're preventing that option, especially as you're rolling out all your goofball autonomous vehicles. So I'm just trying to see. So there's the team, and I want to just show you the advisory council. like who is on the advisory council to this? This is referenced in the social finance document. So you've got someone who is the managing director of the California Policy Research Initiative at Stanford. And again, who is at Stanford? Lara Arrillaga Andresen set up Impact Finance, the field at Stanford University. You have an indigenous woman from the Hoopa Valley tribe. So again, within the commons and the collective range, like I think it is imperative for them to bring into the story arc the indigeneity, right? And so for what it's worth, they know that, so they put that right in the mix. You've got someone, Voice Media, working on Black Voice News. So again, who do you need to be advocating for the open air prison? You need the people who would have a history of being brutalized by the domination culture, and then you get those people up front saying that this new thing is okay and this new thing is the answer. You have someone who's at Omidyar Network. I've talked a lot about Omidyar, reimagining capitalism, right? Raise your hand if you think Pierre Omidyar of PayPal and eBay is looking to reimagine capitalism in a kinder, gentler way. But that's what they're saying. The Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Again, the global superorganism homeostasis. Every time you see peace, replace it with cybernetic homeostasis and regulation through the tokens. You've got someone gathering for justice. I'm not sure. I guess it's a justice program. The senior counselor to Gavin Newsom. You have a senior program officer of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. You have somebody who's a deputy director at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratories. And again, we're getting into social physics and biophysics. And then we have Nils Gilman, who is the vice president of programs at the Berggruen Institute. So if you had any question about, is this initiative interfaced with what the Berggruen Institute hopes to do around capitalism, democracy, and humans, there you go. Someone from Salesforce, the data dashboards, Equality California, a senior advisor on social innovation to Gavin Newsom, someone with Schmidt Futures, that's Eric Schmidt of Google Alphabet, the Lewis Group of Companies, the Black Chamber of Commerce. Again, all of this will become embedded in the opportunity zones. The College Futures Foundation, that's going to be for your learner record and the learning economy. Next Shark, I'm not sure, Media for Asian Americans, Climate Science, because again, you know, as much as we're doing cybernetics around human life, we're doing cybernetics around nature. California Transportation, local government, because again, the social currencies are going to be all about decentralization and putting emphasis back locally, which again, initially sounds great, unless you understand that your local tokens are going to be feeding it like the ant computer, right? Like they know that it's fine to have a local government like empowerment because it's all being modeled. You have a former partner at McKinsey, Healthy Communities, GitHub, Performing Arts, some more folks working on civic engagement. The civic engagement is all the tokenomics for the commons, AFL-CIO, immigrant rights, you know, all the things that sound good if you're a nice progressive person like you care about, only it's going to be all managed within the sphere. I'm just going through, let's see. Here's someone, Pacific Islander lead organization. So they've got all of the different interest groups, all of the different identities represented. The school district, the Erlamart school, someone with the school district, again, is someone else from the California Tribal Fund, because what they're trying to do is link all of the regenerative finance and essentially reframe the gift economy as an impact economy, as a social impact economy, as the sacred economics. And I think that in many respects, people like Charles Eisenstein, their brand is meant to sort of be the bridge between the gift economy and into a cybernetic economy, right? They know that there's an attractiveness in this idea of the gift economy as an alternative to the income disparities of the current state of capitalism. And so they're going to draw it in, but draw it in the language of the gift economy into the sacred economy, which is the circuit. And then you have someone else working, a PhD candidate in AI. Let's see, Elo Technology. Data about the criminal justice system, because again, the prison system is the huge offset for the impact finance. And working on computer vision for diverse social applications, right? The Outside-In robot, they're working on criminal justice and computer vision. Like, that's so obvious. And, I feel bad. Here's this Catalin Voss. This is someone who's been told a story about how good this is all going to be if we can just have HAL 9000 run everything, because they're going to program it for equity and justice, and don't worry, it's going to be great. And then the last individual here is California Forward, which is improving government with inclusive, sustainable growth. So all of this is social impact finance, but just, again, there's a specific person on this Advisory Council of California 100 that has a direct connection to Berggruen Institute. So now I'm just going to read this article, and it might be boring, but I think it'll be good to have for the record. So this came to my inbox. It's on the website of Social Finance. And again, that's, if you're not familiar with Sir Ronald Cohen, please put his name in the search bar of wrenchingthegears.com and see. I've been on Sir Ronald Cohen's case for a long time. I used to sort of think, like, when I was back in we have to figure out who the bad people are, like he was probably up in the top group, but now I'm like, okay, it's not just about the bad people, it's about the structure, so I can back off of Ronald. But he is a key player, and again, when everyone's focused on Davos or Klaus Schwab or that sort of thing, it's detracting from the fact that there's all these other pieces in play. And Raoul did a really nice piece, again, on some of the back history of Ronald Cohen on Silicon Icarus, so you can look up Ronald Cohen there as well. So Social Finance provided technical support to third sector partners in these impact finance deals in San Jose and Santa Clara. I'm sorry that the clarity on this is not great. These are from Little Sis, and all of these maps got taken down. But these were projects that were pay-for-success pilots that were happening in Santa Clara County and Silicon Valley around 2015 or 16, around the school district for pre-K and early literacy, and then later on with Project Welcome Home, which was for housing and Partners in Wellness, which was mental health. And so Social Finance was the technical support for those projects. So when this came, this article is actually from last week. It was appended to a Social Finance email that came to me today. And I'm just going to read it out loud, and I want you to sort of listen for the stuff I'm talking about tokens, decentralized government, optimization, fitness paths, agents that are identified us as being digital agents in the game, and responsive governance in terms of like the whole ant simulation game. Okay, so meet Social Finance's Vice President, Head of Impact Advisory and Public Sector Practice, Jake Siegel. Social Finance, November 15th, 2022. Jake Siegel recently assumed leadership of Social Finance's public sector practice, which he helped establish after joining the organization in 2014. Here, Jake discusses his new role and the continued evolution of the public sector practice. Okay, so the continued evolution. You're managing a large portfolio as head of advisory. Social Finance advisory teams are currently working on more than 24 projects across the U.S. Now, 24 still isn't that much. Like, they still have to scale this thing. If they're going to start to create like Slice and Dykes asset-backed securities, they need tens of thousands, but they're not going to have that until they get the digital identity in place, until they can get these rate cards, and until they can get like the tokenomics working, and both tokens for impact verification and tokens for money. So this is rolling forward, but it's still baby steps, right? So I keep hoping that if we can get more people paying attention, and again, step back from the crypto debacle and realize the goal is to move into tokenization of the commons through outcomes-based impact structures, which this is what this is, right? Like, that was a setup to bring us into this and to allow this to scale. Okay, so could you explain what that work looks like and talk about a couple of projects you're particularly excited about? Siegel. For sure. The vast majority of our work is with the public sector, helping governments build stronger muscles around results and shifting more of our collective focus away from process and towards the stuff that really matters. That means unlocking data to measure performance and help delivery partners get better over time, creating funding models that emphasize adaptability and improvement over compliance, and that pay for outcomes instead of activities, and stitching together multi-agency, often multi-sector partnerships so that we can share data and money in new ways. Okay, so think about that in the background. Keep the ant simulation models in the background, right? Okay, that's a lot. So let me give you a few examples. We've been working with Newcastle County in northern Delaware to help expand home visiting for first-time mothers. We helped put together a partnership between the county, the Longwood Foundation, and a local nonprofit called Children and Families First that uses funding from the American Rescue Plan Act to serve more people, but to do so in a way that's both adaptable and accountable by linking ongoing payment to whether or not we achieve outcomes. Okay, so that's the cybernetics. And I would say it's interesting because Delaware is actually a center of blockchain development, lots of incorporation, like a lot of fintech, reg tech happening in Delaware. You know, they're struggling to stay in the lead because they have this legacy model and that they need to move into the blockchain space. And that's where we see like the Wyomings and the other folks, competing for this new space, to compete to be the new Delaware in terms of articles of incorporation. But for the time being, Delaware is still important. And again, Biden's connection to Delaware is all part of that. Delaware was very early on in the blockchain health record space. We've taken that core idea about the linkages between funding and results and used it in a few different ways. For example, we're working with the Texas Department of Family and Protective Services, Prevention and Early Intervention to build a quality improvement scorecard. You know, a lot of the time, nonprofit service providers have to submit tons of data to government funders, and they get next to nothing back about how they're doing. The work in Texas helps create feedback loops for 130 different providers so they can test things, troubleshoot, and get better outcomes. Now, I will say one of the pieces that I wrote was actually looking at a Pay for Success deal that was in Connecticut that targeted a small group of single mothers who had issues with addiction and were pulled into the Child Protective Services on their radar. So they had these two issues. Now, these women largely were making less than $15,000 a year trying to live in Connecticut, and they were probably self-medicating, like with this addiction stuff. Now, the solution that was offered involved sort of peeing in a cup regularly and getting lectured by people with various kinds of techno solutions that were offered. But none of it materially changed the economic conditions of those women and their children. And yet, the outcomes for that program were being bet on and financed by BNP Paribas and I think QBE, which is French, and QBE Insurance in Australia. And so that's how people's personal traumas get bundled up and bet upon as future betting securities markets. But they're never actually incentivized to fix the problem, which is how can we create stable economic supports for women and children in a time of a lot of upheaval? That wasn't actually the solution that anybody was getting. It was really the metrics were pee in a cup and listen to our script and behave according to what we're telling you to do. And the impact metrics were essentially like staying clean for 90 days or something, which were really marginal. Like it wasn't tied to any sort of long-term outcome success, but it was something that on the Salesforce dashboard per se or something like that, you could check the box and say you hit a certain percentage and therefore the deal was a success and then the investors get their payback. Okay, so going back to the article. So that's why also we think that data matters so much here. It helps bring all of these partners together to get better, but it can also help them make better decisions and pursue some smart, interesting investments. A few years ago, we worked with Ventura County, just north of Los Angeles, on a data exercise looking at how often people experiencing homelessness also touch other crisis services in the county. And so we integrated their homeless management information system with data from Medicaid and 13 smaller systems, including those used for behavioral health and public safety services, to track those overlapping overlaps in service use. And that backed up the county in deciding to double down on supportive housing. All right. So the supportive housing, again, is going to be the smart housing. And so it's about integrating the data as a virtual model for those agents, like an agent as someone experiencing housing insecurity or food insecurity. Public health has been the central focus of much of your work throughout your career. How did that become a key issue area for you? There's no big foundational story here. It's just that I can't help but see health as the biggest, most important issue out there. It is foundational. It impacts everything. Healthcare, not health in its entirety, just healthcare, is itself a third of our economy. A third! And it's probably the most broken third, so the opportunity for impact is just massive. I began my career at the Boston Consulting Group, where I was working in global public health, focusing on a few different issues, including vaccine access, measles in my case, and neglected infectious diseases. And much of the work I was doing was assessing major investments that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation was considering, and trying to bring quantitative perspectives to the magnitude of death and disability averted if those strategies were successful. I moved from BCG to the Bridgespan Group with more of a domestic focus. My work there centered on U.S. health and its intersections with impact investing. I met Tracy, and that's Tracy Palangin, while helping coordinate a federal policy forum called the U.S. National Advisory Board on Impact Investing, a precursor to what's now the Impact Investing Alliance. Along the way, I came to appreciate that gaps in our health systems weren't just cracks, they were canyons. We have incredible medical expertise and technology here. We have brilliant and dedicated professionals working to get more people housing, jobs, education, and healthcare. But none of these things are accessible to everyone. And most of them have huge barriers and often have serious consequences for people with lower incomes. So we have unbelievable inequities and inefficiencies in the country. We are building layer after layer on top of a legacy system that is porous all the way down. And what you get is unfair, riddled with disparity, and economically it's hard to fathom. The further you dig into our health policy ecosystem, the more brokenness you find. It is disheartening, but also there is just tremendous opportunity for impact there. Okay, and that's central because I think the impact space in health, the health is what actually, the health threat, both if there is some sort of public health emergency and then you have to be tracked through track and trace technology, which goes back to the early biophysics and metabolic economies, that's a key piece. And then they can enforce because then you become like a national security threat if you're not tagged and traced in the system, right? But then you also have the wellness aspect, and that's going to be the sweet spot for the impact investing space, is that putting everybody on a wellness management plan and then tracking you with Internet of Things technology that legitimizes the ongoing surveillance. So the public health emergencies are what get you on the blockchain, and then managing you through the smart contract layer and wellness and preventative healthcare is what gets you to the next level. What was social finance like when you arrived back in 2014, and how has the advisory practice evolved in that time? In our early days, Jeff Shumway, who launched the practice in 2014, and I thought of ourselves as, well, essentially the sourcing function for social impact bonds. We saw our role as getting the right people to the table and then putting together smart bets, essentially finding gaps between the status quo and the best in class, and then trying to fill those gaps by doubling down on great interventions. We spent a lot of time in our first year identifying great nonprofits and preparing potential deals. We came to realize fairly quickly that we couldn't just will into existence a market for outcomes and then place bets within the market. This was huge divergence from how governments thought about their role, and it required government organizations to function at the highest level with ability to access historical data, work with lawyers and procurement partners in novel ways, prioritize and define and pay for multi-year outcomes, build measurement systems, and work with new partners. Now, I would say this is what's setting up for the change in democracy. This is what is being set up to shift us from the idea of local elected accountable officials into an AI management smart contract layer, like handing over our interest in how our lives are handled into the AI. Like, this is about the AI. Only an AI smart contract system is going to be able to do all the things that social finance wants it to do. And again, lots and lots about betting and gamification. And I think when you're talking about bets, the bets implies games, and the games implies the ant computer simulation. Okay, so, but they couldn't just will it into existence. They had to convince people, and that's where the storytelling part comes in. We always knew that the SIB, the social impact bond, was a public policy tool meant for public sector leaders, but we had some naive assumptions about government agencies' ability to navigate multiple types of change at once. And so around late 2015 and early 2016, we essentially built a government consulting practice from scratch. I'm sure they had no help, right? It started pretty focused on this vision of building more outcomes-based contracts. We broadened beyond SIBs to outcomes rate cards and other ways of bringing results into the contracting process. We started thinking in principles rather than in tools, centering clearly defined outcomes using data to help decision-making, linking payment and performance, and building collaborative and community-based governance and accountability models. So I'm just going to stop here and say, if you haven't had a chance to listen to the two-part set that Jason, Leo, and I did this past week on Web3 and new models of finance for both emerging tech as a public good, I think that's really important because you should pay particular attention to this idea of the hypercert, David Dalrymple's idea, because he's getting funding directly from Larry Page and Peter Thiel to develop these retroactive payment systems for public goods. And so, again, we're going to be building out the smart contract layer, cybernetic control grid, but they're going to be doing it as a public good. And the idea of social impact bonds is really, really central to all of this. They have to frame it. They have to convince us that it is not a jail. It is not HAL 9000. It is a way of cultivating common will and common good in an efficient way. Okay. Going back to the article, our next big change took place a couple of years before the pandemic, around 2018 or 2019. The deeper our partnerships with jurisdictions became, the more we came to devote ourselves to infrastructure. We always knew that SIBs themselves weren't the point of doing SIBs, that it was about using the tool as a mechanism for broader change. Ultimately, we've become more and more focused on how we can build the muscles of a more results-based public sector, agnostic to any given tool. And I would say this is something I noticed in doing my research, is they continue to flip around the language to confuse points. So sometimes they would talk about social impact bonds. Sometimes they would talk about pay for success finance. Sometimes they would talk about outcomes-based contracts. Now we're looking at like hypercerts. So they continue to change the name and they're like, oh, no, we know that social impact bonds aren't good, but we're doing this instead. We're doing pay for success or we're doing outcome contracts. So it was like a shell game where they kept moving things around and it was a moving target. But ultimately what they know is that they want to be able to program society just like we saw in the ant simulation with the programming. Like you saw at the point where they were like, oh, that ant, it's wandering, it's undirected. It's just bumping around by itself and not getting anywhere with its life. But if we can retune and recalibrate some of the programming metrics for its exploratory behavior and its returning home behavior or whatever, like we can actually steer it into a behavior that is a sweet spot for where we want it. And that's us. That is all of us as ants in a program system. Now, we're not fully living in the ant sim. Like I would say most people who are embedded within social media are living in that simulation, but we're not in it yet in Web3. Soon, the Web3, when it fully comes out and we are identified as agents with a digital identifier syncing to the satellites and syncing to the drones and syncing to the 5G sensor networks and the 6Gs and the web, that the smart contract layer is about these outcomes-based deals managing us individually and collectively towards optimization. And ultimately, what social finance is not going to tell you is that the optimization is towards Huxley's, the imperative of progress, the most progress in the minimum amount of time towards a global superorganism. Okay, so there's an inset quote here. It says, we're helping governments with data access, integration, and visualization so they can make database procurement decisions. We're helping them build performance management systems and tools so they can understand the efficacy of the programs and, if necessary, make adjustments to achieve maximum impact. And again, in the ant simulation, that tool where he's creating passageways and creating blockages, like I think that's what's ultimately behind the impact finance programming. Today, the advisory practice is taking a few approaches to reach that goal. We're helping governments with data access. So I already read this. We are helping strengthen performance management systems and build tools so that everyone can track progress more regularly. Think the blue and red trails, the stigmergic trails, track progress. And so that relationships between governments and community organizations is more dynamic and bi-directional. We need to get past reporting relationships towards something that's flexible to community needs and adaptive to changing circumstances or unexpected events, like a pandemic. I actually think that at the core, a lot of this is about building better partnerships. Things often break down at the borders between jurisdictions, between agencies, between governments and nonprofits and businesses. The big near-term opportunities are in the giant obvious spaces between, where if we can create real partnerships that touch both data and money and then share out the benefits proportionately, we can get big things done. For example, supportive housing is super expensive and often a hard sell since its return on investments is tough for any one agency. But if you add up the value across lots of partners, it's far greater than the cost, So I think in this idea of partnerships, what they're developing, they say they break down at borders. And that's what's behind we had a clip from Giveth, which is an online charity platform. And the young woman, what they were saying is government isn't effective. Government isn't effective. It stops at the border. It only manages things that are within its border. And then that's not efficient. So the goal is within the superorganism is to break down all of the boundaries and create fluid, decentralized, distributed networks. And so that there isn't actually local government anymore. They're going to tell you that being in a node in a global network is local because you happen to be local. But it really is not. It is part of a pervasive computing system that has nothing to do with local. You're just one as any other node. And so the investors in that supportive housing that they're talking about could just as easily be in France or Australia like they were in the social impact bond tied to moms with issues like navigating addiction as anything else. So by breaking down all the boundaries, essentially you open up all of these public challenges to global finance, right? And do we think that BlackRock's computer or that Blackstone, who is the largest single rental family homeowner in the country right now, they want those borders broken down. They want governments to outsource affordable housing to the private sector because the new models of housing that they will create will lead towards this WeWork collective living experience, and they're going to be building those out in the opportunity zones, I think. Okay. You were recently selected as a commissioner for California 100, a statewide initiative from the University of Southern California and Stanford University meant to inspire an innovative, sustainable, and equitable future for the state. Can you talk about your connection to California and why you're so passionate about this work? And let me just see. So just to reinforce, this is this California 100 program. And I think this is the next iteration of the Berggruen Reimagining California program, right? California's governance and fiscal future. So the governance mechanism, the tokenization is directly connected to the public goods finance. Okay, his answer, I moved to California 6 years ago from my hometown of Boston. And again, understand the history of the Boston nexus, both militarization and also sort of this, Protestant Reformation, like frugality of the Puritan and the Pilgrims and like building in, and also the liberalism of Boston, but the interface of Boston as, again, MIT and Harvard and the technology that came out of World War II and the springing of that into the Silicon Valley sector during the Cold War, post-World War II era, and where we're at now. There is this synergy between Boston and the Silicon Valley. Okay, don't get me wrong, Massachusetts is pretty amazing and their state government is impressive, but California to me is a few steps into the future. It's huge, diverse, and full of contradictions, all the things that could be said of the country writ large. Did I mention it's huge? 40 million people. That's a lot more. That's more than live in Canada. Los Angeles County has as many people as Michigan. California counties are fascinating. They have a lot of autonomy and budget authority, in some ways like small states, overseeing big chunks of public safety and health. So they have the ability to make big, localized changes. It's hard to find jurisdictions anywhere that are as interesting and dynamic as California counties. And again, so it sounds like a game, right? And what they're doing is they're carving out bits and pieces. And so California counties, again, California is huge. That means you have a lot, and it also has a lot of immigrants and poor people and children. So those are a lot of agents that you can move around on the dashboard to move your investments, your ESG investment portfolios. And then you can go into different counties and actually still at scale get access to the data, but not be reliant on an overly restrictive system. And so that's why California is a target. It's big, it works as an impact commodity, and eventually its governance system allows them to create these models. And then once in a cloud-based world, once you have the models, you can bring them to scale pretty easily. Okay, and California as a state can put its weight behind some remarkable things. For example, one of our partners in Mental Health Services Oversight and Accountability Commission, it's an agency that oversees one of the most transformative and fascinating funding streams in America. Let me just say that again. It's an agency that oversees one of the most transformative and fascinating funding streams in America, thanks to the Mental Health Services Act, a 2004 voter initiative. It mandates that billions of dollars each year, last year it was $3 billion, gets spent with substantial guidance and engagement from people with severe and persistent mental illness and their families. And it also mandates that 5% of the money, which last year was $150 million, has to be spent on mental health innovation. It's literally a $150 million annual innovation fund focused on mental health, directed by people with firsthand experience that is meant to break down inequities. How cool is that? Only in California. So I'm just like, guys. I mean, think about what we're talking about. So one of those early impact finance programs was Partners in Wellness in Santa Clara County. That was in partnership with the University of California, San Francisco medical system. But the deal verifier in this was Palantir. Palantir was the third party that did the impact data verification. Now, Peter Thiel of Palantir is also investing in hallucinogenics for mental health prescribing. And what we understand is, like, I think within the global superorganism, the prize that they're after is collective consciousness, right? And so they're coming at it from different ways. They're coming at it through education. So that's the cognitive, that is the intellect, that is the problem-solving piece. But then they're also after the psyche. They're after the consciousness. And most of these innovations aren't going to be spent on changing conditions that create anxiety and depression at the population level. And, you know, Jason and I did a whole presentation on mental health about this. It's going to be treating the symptoms. And in treating the symptoms, I think increasingly prescribed wellness. So that will be social prescribing for depression and anxiety. And then also hallucinogenics under prescription. And also, like, Hertzberg was doing stuff with cannabis. I'm trying to look and see. Bergru. So, you know, again, not that I'm like, I understand that the drug wars were about managing excess labor under globalization and getting people, like, introducing drugs into low-income communities, breaking down and fragmenting communities. Like, a lot of that was due to the economics, incarcerating people and then creating revenue streams in prison systems, both in prison labor and managing prison through prison health systems or other things. But the legalization process is also going to be used to normalize mass levels of, medicalizing people when the problem is the social structure itself, and medicalizing people with data streams attached. So I'm just trying to see Hertzberg, like, he was involved in a cannabis proposal as well. And maybe I don't actually have that. Let's see, he was working on issuing stocks on blockchain and opportunity zones. Maybe I didn't add this in, but I'm pretty sure that Hertzberg was working on something. Maybe it was you know what? I think it was actually about permitting companies to issue stock on blockchain. That it was, oh, here it is. It was about cannabis, the cannabis industry being linked to blockchain, and that would help them move their money more easily through the cannabis exchange. So, you know, I think we have to really be thoughtful about the mental health space, and the fact that they're really looking at California as this deep well of innovation finance. And a lot of these deals are structured. And that's, if you know, again, if you listen to the second half of the series Leo and I did, and Jason and I did this past week on public goods finance, like they're going to set up mental health treatment as a public good finance model, right? And so they're going to come in with this innovation, and they're going to start to package deals. And what Dalrymple was talking about with the hypercerts is like, we want a platform that can take every kind of money and track impact over time and then redistribute the profit stream. So sure, we're going to take some foundation money. We're going to take some, you know, because we know these big foundations have to throw off like 5% of their income every year, or they'll run afoul of the IRS. So sure, we have a slot for that. We have a slot for traditional venture capital that's going to pay up front. And then we also have slots for people who want to retroactively pay once we have an impact metric structured. So I think what I would love is for people to start integrating like this vast sort of deep section that I have around impact finance and outcomes-based finance and government contracts with the idea of the smart contract layer and the public goods finance, and then what that works with the data streams towards the building of the organism, because these are all these moving parts. And now I have the lens of not, okay, the impact finance, it is these hypercerts and the public goods funding, and the fact that the public goods funding is linked to, again, you want public input, right? So you want people to have some tokens. So maybe some of the participation in the innovation, and you can hear them talking, you can hear them saying, look, we're getting feedback from people who are impacted by serious mental illness and their families. That is a participation. That is like a social work of proof, right? Oh, you want to get into this deal? Well, you can volunteer. You can provide your input. You can provide your life experience, maybe on a StoryCorps program. You know, maybe your person suffering from mental illness is on disability. So in order to pay for your UBI to keep getting your services, you have to feed your trauma into the machine. And then we're teaching the machine, we're calibrating this machine on trauma. Like this is a global superorganism that, if it's being built out on impact finance, is being weaned on trauma, like on manufactured social trauma. And then what kind of, like, where is HAL 9000 going to go if essentially what we're raising it on is like the breast milk of social dysfunction around the world, of like war. And then we're saying we're doing this for peace. It's a really, really twisted output, but this is all sort of coming to me. It's just really becoming clearer and clearer. And the mental health is central, because not to cure people, but to tap into the consciousness layer and to create new pieces of new financial structures to get there. Okay, so the California 100 is this breathtakingly, almost ludicrously big idea, bringing together a bunch of people from around the state to come up with a picture of what California could look like a century from now. Okay, just picture that, people. I mean, I think there's recognition that you can't really predict 100 years from now. Futurism always feels like a dance between serious and silly. But it forces us to think beyond current policy rights and consider big ideas and the impact of big ongoing shifts to the economy, society, and environment. They've asked me to think about fiscal reform. How do we take in taxes and how do we spend them? I get to go out and talk to people and convene some focus groups. People are naturally inclined to think first about taxes and about taxes right now. I mean, I get that. But I think when I think about the future of California, I'm picturing a more sophisticated state spending its money carefully and effectively, building and managing a system and a safety net that's more personalized and efficient. And I would just say, this is part of my descent map. Let me see. It's over here. Like, the idea of the social safety net for me is so different now that I understand better the history of the Great Society, because I didn't have that at the time. And Lyndon Baines Johnson's this idea of the Great Society and the war on poverty, it was paired with, in 1965, with the law enforcement bills. And so the safety net came with a stick. There was a carrot and there was a parallel stick. And so, yeah, they provided public housing, but then the public housing was policed. They provided after-school programs, but oftentimes the after-school programs were also integrated with the police. And so when you realize that the safety net actually, maybe it was always intended to be the smart contract layer, right? Because Lyndon Baines Johnson, he was the one who appointed Robert McNamara, who was the Secretary of Defense during the early stages of Vietnam under JFK, and then he stayed under Johnson. He appointed him to the World Bank. And again, Robert McNamara had come out of Ford, systems engineering, efficiency modeling, optimization, that he had overseen this idea of the Strategic Hamlet Program, which is these early smart cities based on the reservation model. And, at the time, they were just getting a handle on Internet of Things sensor networks, remote sensing structures. And, that would be coming out, very much throughout the Cold War and the weaponization of space. And so when you understand that social safety net, again, Barbara Ward Jackson was a close advisor to Johnson, among others, and she was from the UK and the godmother of sustainable development. And, I was really appreciative to Raul for bringing her to my attention in his piece on the Nigerian Civil War. She was advising Johnson and McNamara. So we have to understand that the safety net, the perhaps Internet of Things enabled safety net, was always meant to be layered into the smart contract layer, right? And it at the end of the ant conversation, they said, oh, we're going to get to the slime mold, but we haven't had a chance to do the slime mold. I wanted to stop before the slime mold, but the slime mold becomes a slug to move to a new location when it's put under stress and austerity. And once it combines as a slug and moves to a new habitat that's less threatening, it creates a stalk, and on the stalk are these spores that spin out. But the stalk is sacrificial, like the parts of the cellular organism that make the stalk, they give of themselves to the collective to create the next civilization, right? It's a self-sacrifice. And I think the commoning that they're talking about here is something that the global billionaires are going to be using their giving pledge. They're backing a UPI for a circular economic currency of tokenization to treat us like the slime mold, and then through manipulating energy, manipulating finance, manipulating food, can condition us on the petri dish like the slime mold and make us form the stalk to, move into this next layer, whether that's preparing a mind file for interplanetary colonization or interdimensional movement or something else, like some other form of being. And that Robert McNamara being with the World Bank, which is, was setting up the global South with this debt that would create the regulation system that could impose austerity at any time to create the crises to move people in the directions that they wanted them moved in. So that control mechanism that was coming out of Ford, the Ford company, motor company, Fordism, that was merged into Department of Defense and militarism, that was then brought into quote unquote global humanitarian aid and finance. A lot of that was tied to social welfare projects, to the austerity, but then treating the cybernetics of the system towards the slime mold, I think, is important. So anyway, I guess when they're talking about these great opportunities of imagining the future, I would suggest it's important to revisit the past and understand that the safety net was paired with the law enforcement bills. And this is very clear to me because Paul Wormeli was one of the board members of Stewards of Change. All of this is about health and human services data, the HMISS, Stewards of Change and Interoperability Collaborative, which is embedded in Data Zone in Silicon Valley. And Wormeli was with this law enforcement assistance agency. So the pre-K, and then it turns out that this guy who developed, again, it's all about data, right? Integrated data, who developed the pre-K data systems integration. It was initially called iPinwheel. It has a new name now. But he had spent, Mark Crandall, he was a BAE employee and had spent I don't know, a dozen years or so prior to getting the contract to work on the pre-K database system, working on FBI case management software. And that's really important. Like when you understand that the incarceration, the judicial, the quote unquote public safety piece has been always baked into the safety net, including things as innocuous as pre-K, right? Like when you imagine that the FBI case file is like one step away from the iPinwheel pre-K integrated database systems that will also give insights into people's homes, right? Like what I was talking about with the impact finance space, that was mothers who had been flagged for addiction, and they're setting up all of the teachers to be like minders and again, first reporters. But under what circumstances, right? Are you going to start in the community school model reporting people for poverty, right? I'm afraid that this student that is in my care is food insecure. Okay, well then what happens to that family? And is it because that family is a bad family? Or is it because the system is a bad damn system? Like that's what I'm saying. And that's why, I get tired of like the whole central bank digital currency thing, blah, 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 all the time, because it's kind of about that. But really, if we don't get at the impact finance and this history of managing like vulnerable communities, we're not going to get it. Like we're supposed to try to be better people, and we're not going to get there if we don't take on this challenge of the impact finance space, about Web3 in the impact finance space. And it all comes together. These aren't disconnected stories. These are integrated stories that refer to one another, that are self-referential. So sorry for getting worked up about that, but they're so cavalier in how they talk about it. It just makes me so angry. Okay. Their breathtaking, ludicrous idea, whatever. It's actually kind of striking how far behind the public sector is when it comes to technology. I'm in the Bay Area, where companies have been working to predict consumer behavior and shape demand for like ever. I'm going to say this again. It's actually kind of striking how far behind the public sector is when it comes to technology. I'm in the Bay Area, where companies have been working to predict consumer behavior and shape demand for like ever. So think about programming the ant simulation, all right? That makes people nervous. Yeah, it should make you nervous. And that's fair enough. I also don't want to be manipulated by big tech, but I use this scenario as a point of comparison. In most places in America, two agencies serving the same people in the same place have no ability to coordinate with one another in any way. I'm not overstating this. You wouldn't believe how hard won some of our data integration work is. Just matching up people in one agency's records with another agency's records to qualify them into a program or help them improve in case management. Protecting privacy matters, but so does effectiveness, and with some nuance and care, we can collaborate to make services better without giving up key data protections. In the meantime, we've just hamstrung our ability to create systems without holes, to be more sophisticated in matching people with what they want and need. And that goes back to What Works Government in Austin, and the early pilot in Austin for the homeless services, where they were integrating people through their health records. Again, they see that that's the biggest opportunity is health. It's going to be health and education, and health being also mental health. But they put all of these unhoused people on blockchain, not with some sophisticated technology, but literally by linking their biometrics to a QR code and then handing them over a QR code with a laminated poster board. I mean, laminated cardstock, that's the level of technology we're talking about. Like, you can live in the smart contract Web3, and it doesn't have to look like fancy flying cars and robots. It can just look like a world ruled by QR codes, and yes, no mother may I. I like to think there's a future state for California that can navigate these nuances, that can build good and clever partnerships across agencies and with the private sector, that uses its technology and money to create a better social safety net. Learn more about our public sector work or read more about Jake. So that's the end of that. Now, nowhere in here, I mean, they talk about paying for outcomes, but nowhere in here are they saying that the plan is to create global futures markets in securitized human capital. They don't say that anywhere. That's a long form article. So Anyway, I was gonna spend some time and read this article about Silicon Valley, a laboratory of smart surveillance and privatization, but I feel like I do need to stop and get back to working on my slides for Drew. So I'll link to it in the comment section. I wrote it in December of 2018, and what I was doing was making comparisons between these pilot impact finance projects in Santa Clara County and what was happening in Philadelphia, and it is spot on, really. Like my knowledge of it has deepened, but these initiatives like Smart Cities, Machine Q, Internet of Things pilots, the role of the Knight Foundation, installing these Fuse cores, which are fellows for like change agent policy fellows, us being part of Living Cities, these cities of LRNG, which is like gamified education in smart environments, digital badge pilots. Ideas 42 out of Harvard is in both of our communities, the pre-K programs and the charter school lobbying, like all of that was across the board. And then I do break out and I talk about things, the 4 impact finance programs, the Big Lift, which is early literacy, and the role of Data Zone, which is the data integration, Welcome Home, which is the homelessness project, and then let's see. There's also a program about education and neurotech gaming, which is pretty intense, and especially again, as I understand that they're about consciousness and then partners in wellness. So I'm not going to go ahead and slog through all this because you've listened to me yammer on long enough, but this is important. It's not important just because I want you to listen to my podcasts and get more views. It actually is the thing. The ant computer is the thing. Like the efficiency, the social efficiency is the thing. And I had someone yesterday leave a few comments on the talk that Cliff and I did about Sky Woman and Huxley. And I think they missed the point because I think sometimes it's always like, well, what's the bad thing that's going to happen? And what I was trying to do was show 2 different cosmologies. One, which was inherent natural relationality, and the other, which was an engineered optimization with man at the top. And I think if people missed that point, that was the point of the talk I did with Cliff, was that there are 2 different frames to look at the world. Now, we are rapidly entering this Enlightenment version, like the Bentham, the Fabian, the Huxley, towards this omega point, right? And it's going to be ridiculous that they intend to try to drive us there by turning us into an ant computer. It sounds ridiculous. And yet I can so clearly see it. Like if you look back, I would suggest that in the intensity of navigating social network environments over the past 2.5 years, think about it. Think about what I was saying about how these simulations are programmed for efficiency, programmed for movement, programmed to certain gathering and foraging behaviors, collective and clumping behaviors. Think about how that can all be managed behind the scenes. And then imagine that it's not just the time you spend logged into social media, but that it's everything in your life. And that we are all integrated into the Web3 smart contract layer, and that they're going to gaslight you and tell you that it's all about the public good. And that the richest people in the world are going to come up with ways to finance it, to keep funneling their tokens, their token money and control system, to get your data and to force you to participate as if you were a good digital citizen, when really you were just an agent in the ant computer. So, anyway, thanks for joining in. I'll put the link to the blog itself. Check it out, share it. Let's keep the conversations open. Again, thank you so much, Julene, for submitting a guest post on Wrenching the Gears. It's about this new primary partners children's health initiative in Salt Lake City. And underneath that, I think I'll put a link to the program that we did about Utah, the role of Utah in digital identity and synthetic biology. So, all right. Bye, everybody.